The first day at my new job was overwhelming, not because of the workload but because of him. The CEO, Oscar, was a tall, handsome young man who carried himself with a confidence that made everyone around him feel small. But the moment I walked through those office doors, I felt his icy glare pierce right through me. It was as if my mere presence offended him. From the very first day, Oscar's disdain was impossible to miss. He didn't bother to hide it, and I quickly became the target of his seemingly endless irritation. During my onboarding meeting, he stood at the head of the conference room, barely acknowledging my presence. As he explained the company's protocols, he never once looked directly at me, instead focusing on everyone else in the room. When I asked a simple question about a project, he cut me off mid-sentence, his tone clipped. "If you had read the onboarding materials properly, you wouldn't need to ask," he said, not even bothering to glance up from his papers. My cheeks burned with embarrassment as the others in the room exchanged awkward glances, unsure how to react. Oscar's attitude only grew colder from there. In meetings, he rarely let me finish a thought before interrupting with a curt, "That's not relevant," or "We've moved on." He never raised his voice, he didn't need to. His indifference spoke louder than anger ever could. On one occasion, I presented a report I'd spent hours preparing. The moment I finished, he nodded briefly and said, "I'll have someone else look it over. It needs a more experienced eye." I felt the sting of his dismissal as if he'd slapped me, my confidence crumbling in front of everyone. The truth was, I knew why he was so cold. Oscar was my high school sweetheart, the boy I had fallen head over heels for when we were teenagers. But I left him behind without a proper goodbye. Just a single short message saying I had to go. There were no explanations, no reassurances, nothing to soften the blow. I had broken his heart, and now, standing in the same company as him, I could see the pain still simmering beneath his cool exterior. Every evening, I cried silently in my tiny apartment. My feelings for Oscar hadn't changed. I still loved him, even though I knew I had hurt him more deeply than anyone else ever could. Guilt and longing twisted inside me, and I tried to keep my distance, tried to stay out of his way, but it seemed no matter how hard I tried, he always found a reason to be near. Hovering, watching, even while treating me with frosty indifference. It was as if he was punishing himself as much as he was punishing me. My colleagues were polite, but I could feel their unease whenever Oscar singled me out. Some avoided eye contact, while others gave me sympathetic smiles when they thought I wasn't looking. They never openly acknowledged his behavior, but I knew they noticed. In the break room, I overheard whispers. "What's her deal with Oscar? It's like he's got a vendetta." Another replied, "No idea. Whatever it is, she must have really pissed him off." I pretended not to hear, pouring myself a cup of coffee with shaking hands, forcing a smile whenever anyone tried to strike up a conversation. Despite my attempts to steer clear of Oscar, he was always there, hovering just at the edge of my world. It was as if he was punishing himself by staying close, watching me while keeping an icy distance. He'd linger in the hallway outside my office, talking to my colleagues in low, serious tones, yet always within earshot. When I stayed late, I'd catch glimpses of him in the dimly lit office, working at his desk long after everyone else had gone home. More than once, he approached my workspace without warning, his presence filling the small cubicle. His questions were always work-related but delivered with a detached sharpness that made me feel small. "Mia, why are these reports still incomplete?" he'd ask, leaning over my shoulder without waiting for an invitation. His voice was cold, his tone implying that my work was always subpar, even if it wasn't. I was going to finish them before the deadline," I'd reply, my voice faltering under the weight of his scrutiny. "Don't let it happen again," he'd say, his eyes lingering on me for a moment before turning and walking away. I was left with the distinct impression that he wanted to say more, that there was a storm of emotions just beneath the surface, but he never let it show. Oscar's proximity seemed to follow me everywhere. In the cafeteria, he'd sit at a table just across from mine, pretending not to see me while making sure he was always in my line of sight. His conversations with others were animated, charming, But the moment his gaze caught mine, his expression would harden, the warmth vanishing like a light switch flipped off. When I once laughed at a joke someone made, I caught Oscar's fleeting glance. His eyes darkened with a mix of emotions I couldn't read, before he abruptly turned away, the smile on his lips freezing. I tried to avoid the places I knew he'd be. I'd slip into meetings right before they started, taking a seat as far from him as possible, but somehow he'd always find a reason to direct his questions to me. His tone was always just cold enough to make me feel like an outsider. If I stayed quiet during discussions, he would turn to me sharply and ask, "Do you have nothing to contribute, Mia?" It was as if my silence irritated him, but my presence was equally offensive. One afternoon I stayed behind after a tense meeting to gather my notes. Oscar lingered too, shuffling through papers on the table. I could feel his eyes on me, but when I looked up he was already turning away, the set of his jaw tense. It was a pattern I had grown used to. He'd be there when I least expected it, watching me with a mixture of resentment and something else I couldn't name. His behavior left me constantly on edge, like walking a tightrope with no end in sight. Yet as much as he made me feel small, Oscar couldn't seem to help himself. He would find excuses to pass by my desk more often than necessary. His comments, though professional, were laced with a biting sarcasm that I knew he saved only for me. "Try not to mess this up, Mia. I'd hate to have to redo it," he'd say, dropping files on my desk with a sharp click. His expression was always impassive, but the tension between us was palpable, almost like a string pulled tight, ready to snap. And every time after those encounters I'd catch him staring, just for a moment, his face softening like he was struggling with something inside himself. But he always turned away before I could say anything, locking himself back inside the fortress he'd built. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried to keep my distance, he always made sure I was aware of his presence, lingering in my orbit like a constant reminder of the past we both tried to ignore. Then one day everything changed. A former employee who had been fired months before I joined stormed into the office, shouting, demanding to speak to Oscar. Panic rippled through the building as security tried to intervene, but things escalated too quickly. In the chaos, there was a sudden, deafening bang, gunshots. Before I could react, Oscar lunged in front of me, taking the bullet that was meant for me. The world seemed to freeze as he crumpled to the floor, his eyes locking onto mine, even as pain twisted his features. Hours later, I found myself at the hospital waiting for permission to see him. When I was finally allowed in, I hesitated at the doorway. Oscar lay in bed, pale but conscious, and when he saw me, there was no anger left in his gaze, only a deep, aching sadness. "Why?" I asked. "Why did you jump in front of me?" He didn't answer my question. Instead, he asked, "Why did you leave me back then, Mia?" His voice hoarse and weak. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I sat by his bedside. He was so vulnerable, and the weight of everything I had done to him crashed down on me. "My father was involved in something dangerous, Oscar," I confessed, my voice shaking. "He was in the drug trade and we had to flee. I had no choice but to cut ties with everyone, to keep you safe. I was terrified you'd get hurt if I stayed. He died after I graduated from college, and ever since I've been alone. I thought it was my punishment for hurting you." Oscar's eyes widened, the initial shock softening into something more tender, more vulnerable. He opened his mouth to speak but stopped, his face contorting with emotions he had kept hidden for so long. I could see the internal struggle, the way his brow furrowed as he tried to absorb the truth of my words. His hand reached for mine, hesitant at first, but then with a firm grip, as if he was holding on to something precious he had almost lost. "You've been alone all this time," he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. I could see the anger he had carried for years dissolving into something else. Sorrow, understanding, and a faint flicker of hope. His fingers tightened around mine, not with the cold indifference I had grown accustomed to, but with warmth. I nodded, feeling the weight of my confession lighten just a little. "I thought I deserved it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I hurt you more than anyone ever could. Oscar's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as he pulled me closer, his hand trembling but determined. You're a silly girl, he said, his voice breaking but filled with warmth. You don't have to be alone anymore. I watched as he wiped a tear from my cheek, his thumb lingering on my skin as if he was trying to memorize the moment. All those years of pain and regret faded as I felt the familiar, comforting warmth of his presence once again. For the first time in years I didn't feel alone, and neither did he. We had both been broken, but maybe, just maybe, we could heal together.